All right. We are on page 135 in the textbook, Craftsmen and Traders. We've done our test for chapter 7 today. It was a long one, took a little bit time to grade on two. So we're an hour into class already. So the recording will probably be about the usual length, 2 hours. But we won't finish the chapter today, chapter 10. So we'll pick up with it next week. All right, so page 135, chapter 10, Craftsmen and Traders. When the Jews settled in Canaan after their semi-nomadic life, which was interrupted only by their settlement and slavery in Egypt, they had to develop many skills that had already been developed by the Canaanites, whom they dispossessed. Okay, they didn't know a bunch of trades and stuff. They had been slaves, had been wandering in the desert, semi-nomadic, and they come in and conquer this land that is theirs, and they've got to learn a lot of trades, a lot of crafts, and some skills. It says came hard. They never did achieve the same expertise in the making of pottery as that exercised by other nations, and therefore many pots were imported. Jewish pots were made soundly enough, but they never reached the same high standards of decoration as others. When you look at pictures, of pottery, vases, and stuff that have lasted for, centuries or millennia rather, you look at the stuff that comes out of Israel compared to what comes out of other areas of the world, the East and Greece, Rome, and that area, it's vastly different looking. And you can tell this is very, very plain looking what comes out of Israel. The first time pottery is actually mentioned in the Bible is when David was on the run from Absalom and crossed the Jordan to the eastern side. There the Gileadites and Ammonites brought bedding, bowls, and articles of pottery that he needed. That reference there, 2 Samuel, look at that since it's just a couple verses. 2 Samuel chapter 17, verse 27 and 28. And it came to pass when David was come to Mahanaim, that Shobai the son of Nahash of Rabbah of the children of Ammon, and Machir the son of Amiel of Lodabar, and Barzillai the Gileadite of Rogelim, brought beds and basins and earthen vessels, that's the pottery, and wheat and barley, flour and parched corn, and beans and lentils and parched pulse, and then all that other stuff in the next verse too. But we see there he brought earthen vessels, pottery. After individuals developed skills, the skills were transmitted to their own families and groups until it became customary for groups of craftsmen to be found together. All right, we see, we talked about this in the education part. It was necessary to teach, to pass that information, that skill, those skills down. So, number one, it's important so that, there would continue to be carpenters and potters and metal workers, leather workers, linen workers down through time. And often you saw, one family might be known for being potters, okay, and it's that family name that's linked with that craft, that trade, and the same with the other different trades and such. There was a potsherd gate in Jerusalem opening onto the Hinnom Valley in Jeremiah's time, presumably because the potters were in the vicinity. When the wall of Jerusalem was repaired in Nehemiah's time, there was a tower of the ovens, presumably because kilns or bakers' ovens were situated there. As technology and materials developed, and as the population grew, there was a bigger market for goods. Craftsmen therefore joined together to provide mass production methods protected by trade guilds. Centers of crafts placed their own trademarks on the articles they produced, In New Testament Ephesus, the guild of silversmiths was strong enough to promote a public demonstration against Paul, whose preaching was affecting the sale of obscene models of goddesses made in silver, specifically the goddess of Diana, Artemis. He was preaching hard against them, affecting their sales, their money, their income. All right, 136, workers with clay. Clay was dug out from the locality and left exposed to the weather until it was ready for use. It was then mixed with water and trampled into a plastic mud. After this, it was brought to a bench where, with carefully added water, it was brought into the right consistency for work. Additives such as ground limestone were sometimes added to the clay to enable the completed article to withstand heat better and be used for cooking. Isaiah describes the treading out of clay in Isaiah 41:25. Let's look at that. Isaiah chapter 41, verse 25. Isaiah 41:25, it reads, I have raised up one from the north, and he shall come. From the rising of the sun shall he call upon my name, and he shall come upon princes as upon mortar, and as the potter treadeth clay. When the Jews learned to make pottery, they entered into a craft with a long history. 1,500 years earlier, the first pottery had been made by laying a long worm of clay, coil upon coil, until a bowl or pitcher was complete. The ridges on the outside were then smoothed down and decorated. It was extremely difficult to get an even shape on the outside of the vessel. Then it was discovered that such pots could be made in a circular hole in the ground and rotated against the hole. The potter's wheel. The process of rotation was developed further by someone who had the idea of putting the clay on the horizontal wheel. In Old Testament times, a flat wood, clay, or limestone wheel was rotated horizontally on a workbench by hand about an axle that pierced the bench. One person pushed the wheel while the other shaped the clay upon it. When Jeremiah went down to the potter's house and saw a pot being made and then remade, as a fault developed in it, he was watching a wheel of this type. So it would have taken two people to work the clay in. Not until about 200 BC did it occur to those in the trade that a second wheel could be added to the axle under the bench at foot level and could be pushed by the same person as was making the pot by his feet, as we see in the opposite full-page illustration. It is therefore in the book of Ecclesiasticus and the Apocrypha, which was written in that same period, that we have a description of this kind of second wheel. It reads, So is the potter sitting at his work and turning the wheel about with his foot. He will fashion the clay with his arm and find its strength with his feet. Ecclesiasticus 38:19. All right, so some pictures we've passed. Back on the very first page, that's Jerusalem's Hinnom Valley viewed from the old city walls. That's what we're talking about there, the Potsherd Gate. And then on the next page, across, we have a 1st century AD pottery uncovered during an archaeological excavation at Tel Barket, Israel. And they are constantly excavating Israel, Jerusalem, these ancient sites, and they are finding all kinds of artifacts that are just, being added to the pile of evidence that proves the Bible is true. That was one of the arguments against the Bible for such a long time, was there's no evidence. There is no evidence of King David or the prophets. None of them, are mentioned, or the kings that are mentioned of the conquering empires. And, as time has went on, they have found evidence of these biblical people. I was about to call them characters, like they were out of a story, but no, they're real historical figures. And they have found evidence that proves that they were real people. And That's why it's important, to know a little bit about this, because when it comes to like the excavating and the pottery, because it's important, that we can. It's not that we need evidence to believe the Bible, but it helps when the critics raise their critiques, okay, and to be able to point them to real evidence. They're not gonna. It's gonna be hard for them to just believe it on faith like we do, but to help them along maybe toward stepping out in faith and believing, it might take some real evidence for them. Okay, and then down below, earthenware pots of Bible times from Hazor in northern Israel. And then this illustration here, a really good one. I always like this picture. A potter of Bible times at his wheel. He turns the wheel with his feet.
You mean his little feet's going doo-doo-doo-doo?
Yeah.
Okay. Ooh, that would be tough to do.
Yeah. This fellow in this picture actually looks exactly like one of the men at my church. I'm going to have to take a picture of that and ask him if he's been posing for illustrations. Okay, on page 138, we haven't talked. It's going to talk about lamps here in a little bit, but it's an artist's impression of an oil lamp on top of a bushel. Okay, decorating pots. Bowls and pitchers were made on the wheel and were set on one side to harden off. When the vessel was dry, any desired decoration could be added. There were several methods of decoration. Some pots were decorated by making scratches on the surface. In some cases, this was done by pressing such articles as woven rope into the surface before the vessel left the workbench. Other pots were decorated by having colored clay added to the outside, either in bands or in a pattern. Normally red or black clay was used for this purpose. Another method of decoration was by burnishing. The vessel was returned to the wheel, and while it was being rotated, a piece of bone, metal, or pottery was held against the surface to give it a shine that stood out when the pot was fired. In other lands, glazes were developed made of liquid glass. Soda, lead, tin, copper, and silver were needed, but this was not developed by the Jews. Any of the methods of decoration could be combined. There are many possible variations in shape and in decoration to such a degree that it is now possible to date the period when a pot was made from its shape and decoration. This has been used by archaeologists to date the destruction of certain buildings, because no pottery beyond a certain style was found in the ruins. The Canaanite pottery that preceded the Jewish occupation was rounded and had painted decorations, but after the settlement had taken place, shapes were much more angular and burnishing replaced the painted designs. A lot of this information is like, don't take this disrespectfully to, or no disrespect to the author, but it's, a snooze fest. But just bear with it. It's important to know that there were many different trades, and during the history of Israel, technology changed. Like we've looked at the potter's wheel, how it went from, they went from running clay around in a hole in the ground and forming into a bowl to working it on a big, circular slab, having to do it by hand, to what we see here of the guy moving it with his feet, turning it with his feet. And decoration was how pots looked, how they were decorated, changed over the hundreds, thousands of years. And then of course all the other crafts and trades that we'll be looking at too. After the destruction of the Jerusalem temple by Nebuchadnezzar, pottery became very poor, which is explained by Jeremiah where he says in 52:15 and 16, Nebuzaradan, the commander of the guard, carried into exile the rest of the craftsmen. But Nebuzaradan left behind the rest of the poorest people of the land to work the vineyards and fields. So, after the destruction of the Jerusalem temple by Nebuchadnezzar, pottery became very poor, with little variety of shape and no decoration, although the potters did begin to produce jars with pointed bases, which were different. So, when they were occupied there, they came in and took away all the craftsmen, all the people that knew all the trades and the secrets of the trade, how to do this stuff. And so what was produced after that was, I won't say garbage, but pretty much compared to what was being produced before the exile. When Alexander the Great conquered the country, pottery adopted Greek patterns. Jars were made with high necks and vessels were built with rims so that lids and stoppers could be fitted. In addition to the use of the wheel, potters also used wooden molds into which the clay was pressed. Sills were made in the same way, and the two halves of oil lamps were made in molds before being cemented together. It was also possible for the clay to be modeled freehand. Toys, figurines, and ornaments were produced in this way, as were the larger clay ovens produced for domestic use. Potters also made repairs to broken pieces of pottery, using wire and rivets to hold a joint that was then sealed with wet clay. Okay, firing clay. When the objects had been modeled and, if required, decorated, they were fired in one of several forms of kiln. In one, a dome-shaped clay oven was placed at the bottom of a shallow well, which was about 4 feet deep and 10 feet in diameter. Pots were placed under the dome, and the dome was covered with brushwood that was then set on fire. Other ovens were made where the pots were placed on shelves and fires lit beneath. The writer in Ecclesiasticus describes this part of the process too. He records, "He will apply his hand to finish the glazing and will be wakeful to make clear the furnace." Okay, had to make sure and keep the fire going. Pottery produced in this way tended to be, tended to be very brittle. A pitcher put down heavily at the well head could easily be broken, and the finality of breakage was often used as a picture of the finality of coming judgment. Broken pieces were not altogether useless. They were used as scrapers, and they were used for writing messages. In this form, they were known as ostraka or ostraka. The larger pieces could be used for carrying things. Isaiah says that judgment will be so severe that no big pieces are found. They cannot be used for scooping water from a cistern or taking coals from a hearth. As pottery developed, methods of mass production were operated. Apprentices would make rough pots to be finished by master craftsmen. Large lumps of clay were put on wheels, and items were made from the top of the lump. Specialists developed in the preparation of the clay and the maintenance of its consistency in its design and in its drying and firing. David seemed to be organizing things in this direction even in the time of his kingdom. Okay. All right, workers with wood, carpenters. Jesus was a carpenter, and as a result, the work of a carpenter in Bible times has been somewhat idealized. Carpentry was a rough, tough job that demanded a great deal of physical strength and endurance, as well as great skill. There were two aspects to the carpenter's work. Firstly, building, and secondly, the making of smaller objects that included furniture. Until the Romans invented the arched roof, roofs were constructed by laying timber beams from wall to wall and filling in the gaps with matting that was plastered down with mud. The carpenter had to cut down trees and square up the logs so that they could be used as beams. This was done either with a hand adze, an axe-like tool used primarily for shaping wood, or by sawing the length with a primitive saw. Either way was hard physical work. So what you see, kind of like what this is right here, this hammer-looking thing with the blade on the end of it, that's the adze. Until axe heads were made of bronze, later of iron, and were lashed to a shaft. The bluntness of the edge and relatively insecure fastening ensured that the head fairly regularly came off the shaft. This happening was given as an example of manslaughter in Deuteronomy 19:5. If the head was lost, it was a disaster because of the cost of replacement. So the axe head would fly off, and it was common that it would happen. So it was happenstance that it would once in a while hit somebody and kill them. So that's where we see the example of manslaughter there in Deuteronomy 19:5. I believe unintentional manslaughter there. I'll look at that real quick. As when a man goeth into the wood with his neighbor to hew wood, and his hand fetcheth the stroke with the axe to cut down the tree, and the head slippeth from the helve, the light and lighteth upon his neighbor, or hits his neighbor, and he die, he shall flee unto one of those cities and live. Okay, this is talking about the cities of refuge. If something happened, if you made it to one of the cities of refuge, you were safe there until your trial or the situation could be figured out or addressed, I guess. Okay. Saw blades were initially made from ribbon flints set into a wooden frame, and it took 2 men working either side to saw through a tree trunk. Later, metal blades were used and the teeth arranged so that they cut on the pull stroke. The saw is mentioned in Isaiah 41:15 alongside the axe. Because the Jews had been a semi-nomadic people, carpentry had not been one of their developed skills. The standard of carpentry in Canaan in general, therefore, went down noticeably after the Israelite occupation, until the Phoenicians were called in to help. They were expert carpenters, the Phoenicians, and built their trading fleet on this basis. In loaning their skills for the building of Solomon's temple and the other public buildings, they taught the Jews many of their skills, which included paneling, cladding, and carving. Although the Jews adopted carpentry so that their work is described by Isaiah as involving the measuring of line, the use of measuring line, marker and chisels, and compass, they were skilled enough to be taken into exile at the destruction of the temple by Nebuchadnezzar, their work still deteriorated when their alliance with Phoenicia was concluded. The carpenter also undertook many smaller jobs, working on the ground outside his dwelling. Benches were not used until Roman times. Doors, door frames, window lattices, and locks were made for buildings, and stools, low tables, and chests for inside the home. Agricultural implements such as yokes, plows, and shovels were also part of the carpenter's work. The fact that tools were relatively crude meant that a good finish was an extremely skilled task. The hammer was normally a piece of stone. The nails used to fasten together pieces of wood were made first of bronze and later of iron. Holes were bored with an awl, although use in the Bible is confined to making holes in earlobes. We've looked at that before. All right. Page 142, we have an illustration at the top of the page. Carpenters from biblical times using a contemporary handsaw and drill. Notice the other tools around the workbench. Okay. And then to the right, a selection of facsimile carpenter's tools from Bible times. All right, workers with metal. The metalsmith has a very old pedigree. Cain was a smith, and it was one of his descendants, Tubal-Cain, who was described as the forger of instruments of bronze and iron. Cain was the father of the Midianite tribe of Kenites, who seem to have been involved in many aspects of Israel's history. They appear to have exploited the copper of the Sinai with the Egyptians. Artifacts of Kenite metalworking have yielded much of the archaeological information we know concerning ancient metalworking. Gold was one of the first metals to be extracted and used because it is found in a relatively pure state and can be melted at low temperatures and poured into molds. It was refined, like silver, by heating it in a clay crucible and skimming the top of the liquid to remove impurities. It was also beaten into thin sheets for overlay work, and the thin sheets were cut into strips fine enough to be woven into gold thread. Israelite art and craft was at its best in many small objects such as jewelry, and the goldsmiths were therefore important as a group. That is, this is one skill that they seem to have developed, okay, making jewelry and gems. You know, even nowadays in Israel, that's still a very big trade there. Matter of fact, many people get their gems and even diamonds from Israel. I know there's I can't remember what the name of the jeweler is there down in Hattiesburg, but part of their radio commercial that they run is, I can't remember if it's bi-weekly or monthly, but they have their gem importer or whatever flying in to bring them the newest diamonds, but it's still a very big trade there, the trading of gems. Copper was extracted from its ore by heating. It could be beaten and shaped by cold hammering. It was mined from shafts as much as 150 feet deep, and the description of mining given in Job 28:2-11 seems to have been written from some experience. The ore was broken down to small pieces in stone mortars and melted in a simple furnace fired by acacia wood. The furnace consisted basically of a depression in the ground where the copper ingot would ultimately be collected, surrounded by 3 low walls of stone and clay. The third side gave access to a bellows and to the prevailing wind. Remains of mortars, furnaces, and slag heaps are to be found in plenty along the Gulf of Aqaba. So ancient proof that this kind of work was happening and developing over the centuries and millennia. By 2000 BC, metal workers had discovered that by adding up to 4% of tin to the copper, they obtained a harder metal with a lower melting point, which could be poured into molds. This was bronze, therefore it gives way to the birth of the Bronze Age. In the Hebrew language, there is no distinction between bronze and copper. Because bronze was attractive and cheaper than gold, it was sometimes used as a decorative substitute. See 1 Kings 14:27. The copper industry died out in the south because of the lack of fuel. The acacia trees were all burned up. There was no revival of the industry in the country until Roman times. Iron was originally removed as an impurity from copper. It was not until certain technological advances had been made that iron could be extracted from its ore. It required more heat, both for extraction and for shaping. The Hittites developed iron first and exported it and the related skills to the Canaanites and the Philistines. Since iron was much stronger than bronze and the Canaanites had iron fittings to their chariots, the Jews had problems in battle. At a later period, the Philistines, who were not great numerical strength, were able to dominate the Jews because of their monopoly of iron. They were the only ones that had iron weapons and tools and armor. or I say armor. Armor wasn't like what we probably think of nowadays, like mostly metal. It's mostly leather. That's about what it was. In 1500 BC, iron was so new that it was being used to make jewelry, but by 1000 BC, it was being used in weapons. David had plenty of iron to provide construction materials for the temple. All right, let's take a little 5-minute break. All right, we are back. Page 137, I think. No, 146. Not 137. 146. Workers with leather. Tents were originally made from skins. Only later were the skins replaced with goat's hair. A tent maker was therefore a leather worker, and the name stuck, even though leather was used to make bottles, belts, and military equipment such as helmets, shields, and slings. A tent maker or leather worker had first to skin the animal, then remove the hairs from the hide, make it supple for use, and sometimes dye it as well. The hairs were removed by a combination of scraping, soaking, and the application of lime. The hides were then soaked in water containing oak galls and sumac leaves, rubbed with dog manure, and hammered. The smell of the work was so bad that the tanner had to work outside the town in the direction of the prevailing wind, and it was so bad personally that it could become grounds for divorce. When the servants of Cornelius came looking for the house of Simon the tanner at Joppa, it would have been easy to find. Follow your nose.
Dog food on.
Yep.
Interesting.
And poison that sumac.
Sumac, yeah. Yeah.
Huh. That's weird combinations.
Yeah. So there's some really good illustrations here, though. Opposite, a leather worker of Bible times makes sandals outside his workshop. Notice the special leather working tools on his bench. Sharp knives, awls to punch holes through the leather to run your straps through. And then the one at the bottom, 2 tent makers sewing a goat skin. Paul joined the husband and wife tent making team of Aquila and Priscilla for a short period. All right, working with cloth, page 148. Linen and woolen cloth developed very early. Among Jews, woolen cloth was the norm. After the wool from the sheep had been washed, it was combed so as to prepare it for spinning. Spinning was done by using a wooden stick or spindle that had a notch or hook at the end. The other end was weighted with a heavy stone with a hole through its center, called a whorl. The whorl was made of clay, stone, or bone, and gave the stick momentum when it was given a spin. The spinner pulled out some strands of wool from the combed wool, held under her left arm, and attached the strands to the notch or hook. She then gave the spindle a twist and let it fall until it nearly reached the ground. In falling and twisting, the spindle had pulled out a woolen thread that was then wound round the stick before the process was repeated again and again. I've actually got a video for this, so what we just read might have been hard to follow, but I do have a video that is of that. Although natural colors were used in weaving, it was possible to dye the thread. The yarn was cleaned with nitra and soap before dyeing. All right, dyeing. Scarlet dye was made from lice eggs that had been ground into powder.
That's crazy.
Indigo was obtained from pomegranate rind. Purple was obtained from the murex shellfish, or sea snails. The shells were crushed, cooked in salt, and left in the sun so that the secretion would turn purple. Blue was also made from the murex, but another substance was added during the cooking. Yellow was made in Egypt from the safflower, and the Romans extracted it from crocus flowers. The dyes were made by preparing a solution of water, potash, and lime. After 2 days, the pigments were added, and the dyeing was done in earthenware pots or in stone basins. The yarn or skin being dyed was then washed in clear water and hung up to dry.
So obviously lice were common.
Yep. Yeah, we know lice have been around. Yeah, but lice have been around. It was one of the plagues in Egypt, one of the 10 plagues. Maybe scarlet, that color's been around for a long time.
Need like a lot of eggs to use. You know?
Yeah.
Come here, let me get your lice
Come here.
eggs.
Come here.
We're gonna color some stuff.
Yeah.
Down there at the bottom of the page, a weaver works at her outdoor loom. She's got all kinds of colors there. And the opposite, stone weaving weights from the Middle East dating to the Chalcolithic period, 4500 to 2100 BC. All right, weaving. Weaving developed throughout the period of the Old Testament. At first, a horizontal loom was used, which was pegged down on the ground. Later, an upright loom was developed, although there were times and places where both types of loom were used side by side. The horizontal loom was pegged down on the ground with the long warp threads running the length of the required piece of cloth. The yarn, held in a pointed stick, was then pushed alternately between the warp threads. The process was aided by the use of a flat piece of wood that was already passed through the alternate threads. When it was put on edge, the warp threads were separated out so that there was plenty of room for the weft thread to be passed through on its stick. On the return journey, the stick had to be passed over and under each successive thread. Eventually, it was realized that if the same warp threads that were pushed down by the flat piece of wood could be pulled up for the return journey by fastening them with loops to another piece of wood, the stick could be passed rapidly in the other direction too. This made it possible for the stick to be replaced by a shuttle. The shuttle was certainly in use by the time of Job, and the horizontal loom was in use in the time of the judges because it was used by Delilah to weave Samson's hair into a piece of cloth. The pin mentioned in this story was used for beating down the weft so that the threads became compacted together. The problem with the horizontal loom was that the width of the cloth was limited to the arm span of the weaver, because the weaver had to sit or crouch at his work. The invention of the upright loom enabled wider material to be made because the weaver could walk across the face of the cloth. In this case, a heavy wooden framework was built like a square archway, and the warp threads were hung from the crossbeam and weighted down with a series of pierced stones or clay balls known as loom weights, what we see in the opposing illustration. The material was then made top to bottom, and the pin was used to push the weft thread together at the top of the loom. The final development of the loom was one in which the weights were replaced with a roller that could wind up the finished cloth. The weaving was then done bottom to top. Such looms did not lend themselves to the making of complicated colored patterns, and even embroidered cloth may refer to different cloths that had been sewn together. It did, however, mean that cloth could be shaped on the loom by varying the required number of warp threads. Okay, we'll set that in the memory bank somewhere. All right, so I had a video for this. Let's see if I can find it. Shouldn't take long. I watched it recently.
There's one simple hearing hack anyone can use to improve their hearing almost overnight. Did you know that hearing impairment...
Just clap these things together.
Okay, this video is from the channel Psalm 133, no space, and it's called Nazareth Village Meet Hannah the Weaver.
This is Hannah. The first order of business is to take the sheep and to shear them. Okay? And you want this for free. Then we take the wool and we wash it with water to clean it. And then we color the wool with natural things, such as the skins of onions, Zwiebelschalen. Okay? We use different green growing plants, such as fig leaves, Feigenblattblätter. More expensive is the spice saffron. You've got a complicated process to get blue and purple. It's not automatic. And you need a special fixative to make the colors stay on the wool. But the Romans used urine.
Yeah.
Okay? Yes, exactly. Okay, so the blues and purples became known as the colors of kings and emperors. No magic. She spins her hair. She's rubbing the fingers of her left hand, spinning the spindle of the right, and pulls at the top to control the thickness of the thread. Hannah makes this look so easy to do, but it's not. She has 2,019 years of experience. It's all of the latest. It's very good for your skin. Okay, then she hangs the string on the loom in double threads for strength. She ties it down with weights on the bottom. From the back side of the loom, past the front row, and then she uses the shuttle to pass the new horizontal row through between like this. Okay, a little bit more will show you. Okay, and the shuttle. Then she has a comb. She tightens the row into place with a comb, and that is how new rows are added. The finished product is 100% wool. It's totally, utterly handmade, and are natural dyes only. No artificial dyes, glitters, sugars, additive sweeteners, non-GMO, gluten-free, and vegan. It's all the work of Hannah. Thank you, Hannah. Let's give Hannah a round of applause.
And the rest of the video is just a picture video montage and loud music.
Seems like a lot of work.
There's nothing more powerful than
Alright, this one is CBN Israel is the name of the channel, and the video is Rare Discovery of Ancient Fabric from King David's Time.
The discovery took place on this hill in southern Israel. Archaeologists found the royal color purple fragments in the Timna Valley, and through carbon dating, confirmed the fabric had been preserved for 3,000 years.
The real excitement was when Dr. Naama Sukenik, called me one day. She told me, well, we found this proof, the molecules of the coral from the lab. It's true purple.
True purple comes from an ancient sophisticated process used...
That's the snails and them working to extract that from the snails. It takes a lot of snails to get the dye.
Zinc dye extracted from sea snails found in the Mediterranean Sea. It usually took a lot of work and thousands of snails, which made the dye sometimes worth more than gold. The dry desert conditions in the valley preserved the fabric.
So we found in Timna the argaman, the more purplish color, which is associated with kings. Also the priests and also the tabernacle. It provides an excellent background to the biblical record for this particular time.
The region is mentioned a number of times in the Bible. The Timna Valley is located in the Negev Desert in southern Israel, and it's also the area of the kingdom of Edom.
In the book of Genesis, chapter 36, we hear about the kings of Edom that ruled over the land of Edom before Israel had kings.
This land is also where Gideon defeated the Midianites.
We hear in the book of Judges about the kings of Midian. When Gideon, he killed all the Midianite kings, the spoil is actually the purple, the argaman garments. So we really have a physical evidence. You can, touch the...
What he's saying there, Gideon, the spoils of that war, like when they would go to war, the spoils would be what they gained, sometimes it'd be treasures and stuff like that. But for them, the spoils of war was the purple cloth. I mean, that stuff was valuable, and it was hard to make. Like they said toward the beginning of the video, sometimes more valuable even than gold.
The garment of an important figure, if not the king, of these people 3,000 years ago.
And where David defeated his foes.
We read in the Bible that King David went to south of the Dead Sea, the Valley of Salt, in the book of Samuel, and then he conquered the Edomites and put garrisons all over the land.
Royal purple is also mentioned in the New Testament. Lydia from Thyatira in the book of Acts was known as a seller of purple, and purple is mentioned in the Gospels.
We hear that the Romans, they actually forced Jesus to wear a purple robe in preparation to the crucifixion. The Romans claimed that he wanted to become the king of the Jews.
Ben Yosef believes this discovery revolutionizes our understanding of the Bible.
I think that this is a game changer in the way archaeologists and biblical scholars understand the reality at that time period.
Some archaeologists dismiss the Bible because there's no traditional architectural evidence for ancient kingdoms like a city or a palace. But he says they were nomadic kingdoms that left little evidence behind.
If you change the way you think about kings and kingdoms in this early period.
Yeah. What he's pretty much getting to here is the evidence of, that's what the critics will say. There's no evidence of these cities that's talked about. Of course, Jerusalem was one that was established. But before that, before Jerusalem became what it is, with all the permanent buildings that have lasted for thousands of years, the Jewish people were a nomadic people. They weren't going and building cities that were going to last for centuries, millennia. So they didn't leave a lot of evidence behind. But something like this piece of purple cloth, what's so important is, or what's so neat about that is, who would have been wearing purple cloth? Royalty, the priesthood. So that would have belonged to a very, very important person during that time. And like they said, they traced it back to the time of King David, to that area. So, I mean, it's very, very interesting stuff. And I like it because, it's giving further proof. Like I said before, the Bible doesn't need, proof to be believed, but it is neat to have it and to see it come to light, these certain things. All right. Workers with Stone, page 152. Masons were the partners of carpenters in building. Masonry was another craft that had to be learned by the Jewish people. The Jews destroyed the large and well-fortified cities of the Canaanites, and they did not learn how to rebuild them until, at a later date, they were helped by the Phoenicians. The masons' work started at the foundations, where a trench was filled with rock and lime and allowed to settle. The walls were then erected on the foundations. Paul's point that in preaching he did not build on another man's foundation is probably based on a contemporary custom that the man who built the foundation also built the walls. In a good building, of Cornerstones were placed at each corner, large and square. It was because such large stones were not suitable for the rest of the building work that they could be left to one side by the builders, only to have the builders discover that the stones were necessary to give strength and direction to the building. Such stones or chiefs became metaphors for the prominent and stable men in the community. The cornerstone, of course, Jesus is referred to that as well. When a good building was being erected, limestone blocks were cut in the quarry. The limestone was always softer when it was hewn underground. It hardened on contact with the air. The general practice was therefore to cut the blocks roughly to size in the quarry and then finish them by chipping away the surface on site. When Solomon's temple was built, the blocks were finished in the quarry where a more accurate finish could be obtained because the blocks were still soft. The walls were kept true by reed and plumb line. The reed was a straight cane about 20 feet long. The plumb line consisted of an inverted lead cone attached by a line to a wooden rod of the same diameter as the base of the cone. When the rod was held on the side of a building, the edge of the base of the cone would just barely touch the wall lower down if the wall was true. A line was used from corner to corner, and a layer of stones was built up to the line before proceeding to the next course. Okay, what they're talking about here is making sure the building was being built truly. Okay, it wasn't leaning. Okay, it's like having a good foundation is important, but also when you go and you build upon that foundation, you make sure that you're building, squarely. The Leaning Tower of Pisa, okay, when they built it, they're building straight up. Okay, they were building truly, but their issue was the foundation. Okay, you know what Pisa means? It means marshy ground. Okay, so they were building on marshy ground. They only dug 10 feet deep for the foundation. Not very deep especially for how tall the building is. So before they even finished it, it was already leaning. Okay. So that's why it's important to have a strong, deep foundation, and that's why it talked about how they would go in and fill it with stone and lime, and they would allow it to settle, to compact, and then you could go and build on it and not worry about it giving. Where I live, the house had an old foundation, and they went in and poured the new foundation on top of the old faulty one. And so the new foundation, as years went on, began to have faults as well. Okay, so the foundation is very important. So the workers with stone, they were very important, especially as time went on, and you see the buildings kind of go from a nomadic lifestyle to now they need people to start learning these trades because they're wanting to establish cities, permanent cities. Now that they have went in and occupied the land that the Lord had promised them. Okay. Page 153. Stone was not used for many houses. Amos regarded stone houses as a luxury made possible by the exploitation of the poor. Only public structures such as the temple, city walls, and the store cities such as Megiddo were normally built of stone. Phoenician builders probably helped on all those projects. The quality of the building was clearly to be seen. Stretchers and headers were used to strengthen the walls, and the stones were often so accurately fitted that there were no gaps between and no need for mortar. Masons in Bible times found problems, however, in providing windows in a stone wall. Jeremiah considered windows to be unacceptable luxuries. Most houses were built of mud brick, made from mud and straw and wooden molds and left to harden in the hot sun. Mud was then used both as mortar and as plaster for the inside and outside of the work. Other cruder houses were constructed from a mixture of stones and mud. The mason was also involved in the building of silos, wells, cisterns, public buildings, arches, roads, and aqueducts, the later three in Roman times. So arches, roads, and aqueducts were only constructed during Roman times. With the development of the arch, it was the odd-shaped keystone that held the arch together. Perhaps Peter had this concept in mind when he put forward Jesus as the one who will hold the Jewish faith together and stop it from falling down. So what he's talking about, the odd-shaped keystone, right, it's the stone at the top of the arch, okay? The center stone is what holds it together. So here in the middle of the arch, you have your square bricks, and then you have that kind of angled stone in the center, and that's what fits it together and keeps it from falling. And that's what Peter is comparing Jesus to. Okay, back on page 152. A huge excavated stone-faced grain silo at Megiddo. Only major buildings and cities were built in stone in biblical times. So that's a grain silo. They would have stored grain there. And in the green box, jewelry making. The Jews developed the craft of jewelry making and engraving. Ivory was carved and used for inlays. Small cylinders were engraved and were used as personal seals. This craft developed naturally because as nomads, it was not possible to carry a lot of material around. Okay, and plus carrying stuff around for jewelry making, that's not, that's not a lot. It's not a cumbersome trade. Okay, it's not like you're going to be carrying around hundreds of pounds of material to do that kind of work. Page 153, the picture there, Jews at prayer at the western wall, or the Wailing Wall, on the perimeter of the Temple Mount area in Jerusalem. The lower courses of masonry date from Herodian times, from times of Herod, or the Herods, rather. Page 154, the picture there of the arches, or actually that's an aqueduct. In Roman times, the mason was involved in the building of arches and aqueducts. With the development of the arch, the keystone held the arch together. This impressive aqueduct once supplied Caesarea with water. Very nice. All right, workers with medicine, page 154. Jews were promised health if they obeyed God's laws in Exodus 15:26, and they were given a number of health laws, such as regular rest and relaxation, eating suitable food, avoidance of contaminated water, marriage regulations and cleanliness, separation from contagious disease. Quarantine is actually a biblical, health principle. Okay, that's what it's talking about there. Which when followed, led to a high level of good health. If the laws were disobeyed, disease resulted. There was no call for doctors, and anyone who resorted to them came under criticism for going against the will of God. This happened to King Asa in 2 Chronicles 16:12. The correct procedure in illness was regarded to be prayer to God. We've read about that already. But there was a different attitude in other countries. In Egypt and Babylon, disease was looked upon as the result of evil spirit activity, and doctors were required to counteract this. Although medical work was sometimes at the level of magic, it also brought about surgery and the development of medicine through herbs. There were even laws that controlled the work of doctors. The Hammurabi Law Code said that if a man operated on another man's eye using a copper lancet, and that man lost his eye, then the doctor's eye was also to be put out with a copper lancet. Yeah, the Hammurabi Law Code is where we get that. Okay, very, very early writing. That's very much the mentality of that code.
You accidentally couldn't help this guy's eye. You had to give your eye.
If you are the cause for him losing his eye.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Mm.
The Egyptians were skilled in brain surgery. They bored holes into the skull to let the evil spirit out.
Oh, way down
In
there.
so doing, they relieved the pressure within, which sometimes led to cures. This was also done in Lachish. The Egyptians also practiced dentistry, and some Phoenicians had gold teeth. And that is a common practice in medicine. They will drill into a skull to relieve the pressure, to keep in the brain. I think to keep it from swelling. And so sometimes by doing that, though they were doing it to let the evil spirit out, by doing that, they sometimes cured the person. Despite the theological attitude of the Jews, much of the attitude of the surrounding nations seems to have rubbed off on them. At the popular level, people seem to have worn charms to ward off evil spirits, and doctors were around, as King Asa knew. Exodus 21:9 seems to indicate the use of a crutch when a limb was broken, and Hezekiah made a poultice to treat his boil. By the time the book of Job was written, attitudes were changing, because one of the important points of the book is that Job's sickness was not the result of sin. In the 2nd century before Christ, Ecclesiasticus says that although God is the creator, he gives gifts of healing. Isaiah said that Judah's condition needed cleansing, bandaging, and ointment. Wine mixed with myrrh was used as a painkiller in Matthew 27:34. Mandrake roots were believed to aid conception, and midwifery was practiced throughout Bible times. So we do see, as the Bible goes on, that wasn't, always the case. Believing that, going to God, that prayer to God was the main thing. Doctors weren't to be trusted. And if you went to a doctor, it was, like you didn't trust God. But we kind of see that change as time goes on. All right, in the green box on 154, health laws. God gave the Jewish people a number of commandments, and their medical significance has been appreciated only in recent years. Deuteronomy 23:13 ensured that the soldier carried a spade so that all human excrement could be buried. Leviticus 13 ensured isolation for people who had leprosy. It has been suggested that the insistence on circumcision has led to a very low incidence of cancer of the cervix among Jewish women, and that the forbidden degrees of marriage were given to control a number of hereditary diseases. Yeah, that's also something that's, when it comes to keeping sex within the boundaries of marriage, that helps to prevent, STDs and stuff like that. There was a conversation that I was overhearing from some of the youth, and they got to talk. STDs got brought up, and they were sitting there. I can't remember exactly where their conversation was going, but I just commented. I said, "You want to know how you stop from getting those? Abstinence. Wait until you're married." Okay. I said, "You won't have to worry about it." I said, you shouldn't have to worry about that, because you should be waiting till marriage. But of course, that's not the kind of culture that most of these kids are growing up in. But anyway.
What is excrement?
Yeah. Page 155. The picture there, a coin from Tiberias on the Sea of Galilee, depicting the Hellenistic deity Hygeia, the symbol of therapeutic hot springs of Hamat Tiberias. All right, medicine in Jesus' time. By the time of Jesus, there was therefore an uncertain attitude toward medicine. Mark 1:32-34 seems to indicate that disease was a major problem. Diseases including leprosy, diseases of diet and pollution, dysentery, cholera, typhoid, beriberi or dropsy, blindness due to the dusty climate, deafness, and crippling diseases. Epilepsy and other nervous disorders were also present. Reference to these diseases can be found in those verses. When looking at this situation, the Jews were still uncertain about doctors. They believed there was a connection between disease and sin, and cited sayings, I think that is supposed to be sayings actually, savings, such as "Physician, heal yourself." But for all that, every town was required to have a physician, which is why the woman with the issue of blood was able to consult the number of them. And there was always a doctor in the temple to look after the priests who had picked up things through their habit of walking barefoot. Mark clearly didn't think much of doctors. Okay, well, I definitely want to read that. All right, Mark chapter 5, verse 6. 26, yes, sir. Thank you. And if anybody's got that, then you can read it.
And had suffered many things of many physicians, and had spent all that she had, and was nothing better, but rather grew worse.
Carry on.
Yeah, and had spent all that she had and was nothing better, but rather grew worse. Yeah, I guess he's insinuating that by adding that last part, but rather grew worse because she had consulted many physicians, or had suffered many things of many physicians. So I can see what where he's getting at. Jesus' attitude did not contradict the Old Testament. He seemed to regard disease as the result of Satan's evil activity in the world, and that as such it must be combated. However, Jesus did not believe that disease was necessarily the result of individual sin. This is clear in John 9, 2 through 4, if we repunctuate the sentence. As he went along, he saw a man blind from birth. His disciples asked him, "Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind?" Jesus, "Neither this man nor his parents," said Jesus, "but this happened so that the work of God might be displayed in his life." Jesus accepted that some diseases were the result of spirit possession and dealt with them accordingly, but he did not treat all disease by this method. It was this attitude towards sickness that accelerated the Christian acceptance of physicians in the early church. Luke, as a doctor, was a traveling companion of the Apostle Paul. He was, of course, a Greek doctor, and in Greece, medicine had been developed considerably. Following the teaching of Hippocrates, doctors took an oath that the life of a patient should come first, and that they would never take advantage of women, that they would never procure abortions, that they would never reveal confidential information. There was a large school of medicine in Alexandria, and that's still Hippocrates, the Hippocratic Oath, thousands of years old. Very few Jews were therefore likely to become physicians, but they were often glad of a physician's services despite the many misgivings. Okay. Well, we may end up only lacking a few pages by the time we get done. So we'll see. All right. Workers with money and goods. Traders were concerned with measurements and money. Before we look at the way traders worked and lived, we will examine the measurements and money of the Bible. All right, linear measurements. Linear measurements were developed from the proportions of the human body. The finger, the palm, the span, which was the distance between the thumb to the fingertip. The cubit was the distance from the elbow to the middle fingertip. And the rope or fathom was the distance from the tip of one middle finger to the other middle finger with the arms extended. This gives a table of length as follows. 4 fingers equal a palm, 3 palms equal 1 span, 2 spans equal a cubit, and 4 cubits equal a fathom. Yeah, this is just that ain't gonna be on the test. Like the number stuff. The cubit and the fathom, like the distance, like what is represented as, like the cubit is from the distance of an elbow to the end of the finger. Okay, that's an important thing to know because that was a measurement that Noah used when he built the ark. Okay, and the fathom, that's important too. So those might be on a test. This system was not without its problems. Body measurements varied from person to person, and there is evidence that there were differing lengths of cubit from about 17.7 inches to about 20.5 inches. There was a long or royal cubit of 7 palms or 28 fingers. Royal measurements were larger than standard. There were also old cubits and new ones. In general, however, the system was easily understood and approximate measurements could be calculated. Longer distances were vaguely worked out in terms of several days' journey. Much later, the Greeks used a measurement called a stadion, or stadia as the plural, which is just over 200 yards and is mentioned in the book of Maccabees. Distance was not used for calculating area as in our system. An acre was the amount of land that could be plowed by an ox in a day. The maximum distance that could be walked on the Sabbath day's journey was 2,000 paces, a there and back distance of a Roman mile, and was used for cereals. Oh no, we'll skip the whole paragraph there. Okay, capacity. Capacity was originally measured in a similar homely way, the name of the container giving its name to the weight. The largest dry measure was the homer, which means donkey load, and was used for cereals. The ephah was a large container with a lid, and according to Zechariah, was large enough to hold a woman. It was 1/10 of a homer that was used to measure cereals. The omer, or the sheaf, was the smallest measure for cereals and was 1/10 of an ephah. It was probably the same size as an asarion, which actually means 1/10, and was used to measure meal. The liquid equivalent of the ephah was the bath. This gives a table on base 10. And you got those numbers there. Quite unrelated to this decimal table was the hin, which was used to measure offerings of oil and wine, which was equal to about 7 pints. 1/6 of a hin was the minimum amount of water needed each day. Greater accuracy seems to have been developed in later times. The Assyrians developed a system on base 6. Their system was 6 ka. I don't think that's supposed to be quarts. 6 ka is equal to a sittu, and 30 sittus is equal to 1 gur. All right, the words sound very close to the Hebrew words kab, seah, and kor, and it may therefore be that the Jews adopted the system and used it side by side with the old one. This would mean that following graph. The kab is mentioned in the siege of Samaria, in which a quarter kab of dove's manure or seed pods was sold for 5 shekels of silver. The seah was used to measure flour for cereals, and the kor measured large quantities of liquid and was the equivalent of the homer. We cannot work out the exact English equivalents, but the donkey load or kor is estimated to have been about 200 metric liters, about 58 gallons. Okay, the word to weigh is shekel or shekel in Hebrew, and for this reason the shekel became the basic weight. Absalom's hair weighed 200 of them. From the figures given in Exodus 38, 25, and 26, we can work out that a beka was half a shekel and a talent was 300 shekels. At a later date, another weight was added called a minna, which was probably 50 shekels. This gives the following table. You got those numbers there. The names in the preceding table were adopted in other countries, but the multiples and the actual weights were different. Added to this was the complication that there seemed to have been 2 sets of weights used by the merchant. A light set was used when purchasing and a heavy set when selling. This gave the trader a legitimate percentage profit, which was not wrong in itself. It was mixed weights that were the problem, or the deliberate use of false weights in order to cheat people. Weights themselves were often shaped stones carved into animals and other subjects and marked with their weight. They were used in scales and balances. It is estimated that the talent weighed between 75 and 80 pounds. It took its name from the large, heavy lid of a container. Okay, coinage. In the earliest days of the Bible, trade was done through barter, but it was soon recognized that it was more convenient to exchange something than in its turn could be exchanged for something else. This was done through weighed quantities of metal. Abraham therefore weighed out 400 shekels of silver in payment for a burial place for his family. Metals used in exchange were mainly gold, silver, and copper. At one point, metals were made into standard shapes such as discs, bars, and rings, but true coinage did not start until the 7th century BC. The king's mark was then put on a piece of metal to guarantee its weight and purity and therefore its value. Coins are not mentioned until quite late in the Bible. Only in Nehemiah's time do we read about derricks of gold, which were minted by Darius of Persia and took his name. Coins became more plentiful in New Testament times, but there were so many types that money was quite confusing. 3 systems of coinage were in operation. The Roman coinage had international currency and was made in coins of copper, bronze, silver, and gold. When Jesus told his disciples to take no gold, silver, or copper in their purses, he was probably referring to the coinage. Okay. The Roman coins are very familiar in the New Testament. Jesus said that if we are sent to prison by an adversary, we will not get out until we have paid the last quadrans. Matthew 10:29 tells us that 2 sparrows were sold for a sestertius. The workers in the vineyard of Matthew 20 each receive a denarius, which was the standard wage for a laborer. 2 denarii were paid to the innkeeper by the Good Samaritan, and Jesus called for a denarius when he was asked questions about the tribute money. Okay, Jewish coinage. The Romans allowed local coinage to circulate in addition to their own. There was a very limited Jewish coinage. Coinage seems to have been minted by Nehemiah, probably to pay the temple tax. Nothing else was heard of coinage until one of the descendants of the Maccabees wrested the privilege from the Syrian overlords. In New Testament times, the sole Jewish coin was a copper lepton, which means thin. The widow put them in the treasury in Mark 12:42. It was equivalent to about half a quadrans. The first real Jewish coins were produced at times of revolt between AD 66 and 70 and between AD 132 and 135. Greek coinage. The other coinage in use was Greek money, originally from the mint set up by Alexander the Great at Ago and subsequently minted at several centers. This table of coinage was the drachm, the didrachm, the tetradrachm, and the mina. And then a large number of mina was equal to a talent. The drachm was the equivalent of a denarius. The stater was therefore 4 denarii. Again, the coins are mentioned in the New Testament. It is a drachm that the woman loses from her headdress in Luke 15:8. The tetradrachm was used for 2 people, a couple sentences down. This is the coin that Peter found in the fish's mouth to pay the tax for himself and Jesus. It was probably 30 tetradrachms that Judas received for the betrayal of Jesus. The mina was the pound that was given over to servants by their king. The talent was a large amount of money, not a coin. It was used to describe an impossible debt, such as 10,000 talents, in Matthew 18:24, and in the parable to which it lends its name in Matthew 25. Okay. 162. Money changing. Are any questions or comments? We went over about 30 pages by now.
Bad.
Okay. And if we go to 11, we can probably finish this chapter. I don't know if I want to do a huge long test on this though, because like when it comes to the like the last couple pages we've been going over, like hardly any of that will be on the test. Maybe some of the stuff in regard to like Bible references, but as far as like memorizing the charts and the equivalencies of currency and stuff like that, and the equivalencies of measurements, that's not going to be on the test. Pause it for the moment. All right, page 162, money changing. Those who worked with money had plenty of opportunity for employment. Money changers were needed when specific coinage was required, and 10% was normally charged for the exchange. Most important was the money used in the temple, where it was needed to pay the tax and to pay for sacrificial animals that had been certified as ritually clean. Some people believe that Nehemiah minted special coinage for this purpose, and that this practice had been continued. 12% was charged for such exchanges at the temple. When Jesus drove out the money changers in the temple, he seems to have been acting out of the principle of two messianic prophecies. It was not that the money changers were doing anything criminal, but that it was not an activity good enough for the house of God. People who exchanged money were also able to make loans. In fact, the table over which money passed was called a bank. Jesus suggested, in his story of the money entrusted to the king's stewards, that it might have been invested so as to make interest. There is an issue here that needs to be understood. In Old Testament times, life was based upon a simple agricultural economy. Nobody needed loans for investment. Loans were needed to tide a person over hard times. For this reason, charges of interest was not allowed, because that would have been making a profit out of a brother's plight. But such a profit from interest could be made out of a foreigner. By New Testament times, the economy had changed, and it was possible to lend money to support a business venture and to expect a return for it, as in the parables. But Jesus still disapproved of private loans at interest. Taxation. Others were employed in taxation. In the early days of Israel's history, taxation was used only to support the tabernacle and temple. When the people wanted a king, Samuel warned them that they would face increased taxation, and so it proved. Solomon's building program and lifestyle demanded heavy taxation. Yeah, he had a lot of women to take care of and to pay for. Tax commissioners were appointed by the king for 12 districts. And when I say women, I mean wives and concubines is what it says there in the Bible. Hundreds. Tax commissioners were appointed by the king for 12 districts, and the burden of taxation was so high that it caused a rebellion that divided the kingdom very soon after Solomon's death. There is evidence that this form of taxation continued in the kingdoms of Judah and Israel. Ostraca found in a Samaritan storehouse included receipts for oil and wine, and the handles of jars found throughout Judah indicated that the jars contained oil and wine sent to the king. Even the first cuttings of the grass seem to have been taxed during the time of Amos. The most objectionable form of taxation was the payment of protection money. It was a practice of powerful kings to force their neighbors to pay them taxes. Any infringement would be regarded as rebellion and would be followed by a punitive expedition from the army of the more powerful state. Tiglath-Pileser of Syria extracted such tribute from Israel while Menahem was king. And Necho of Egypt did the same thing to Jehoahaz of Judah. In New Testament times, tribute by taxation had to be paid to the Roman Empire. Roman officials would sell the right to collect taxes in an area to the highest bidder. The tax commissioner or the chief publican would then have to supply a certain amount of money. He would employ local people as the collectors, publicans, and both commissioner and collectors would tax excessively so that they made a good living as well as passing on what was required by the government. Zacchaeus as chief publican admitted fraud by restoring goods fourfold. Levi would have been a local collector. The Jews hated the publicans not only because the publicans took the Jews' money, but because publicans were regarded as traitors to the occupying power. The name was therefore a name of derision. Jewish leaders could not accept Jesus' friendship with such people. He's a friend of sinners and publicans. Dislike of the publicans was not entirely unjustified. John the Baptist spoke generally of the need of the publicans not to be greedy. Okay, trading. A living was also made from the profits of trading. This did not happen in early days because the simple agricultural economy not only gave no profit margin to make trading possible, but the prevailing attitude was that the simple life was the right life. Yet by the time Ezekiel was written, there was extensive, Ezekiel 27:17-24 was written, there was extensive trade in agricultural produce, such as wheat, olives, early figs, honey, oil, and balm being traded with Tyre. Oil and wine were also exported to Egypt, where there was a surplus of grain. Wool and woolen cloth were exported to many areas, and in return there were imports of timber, metals such as those listed, and luxury goods like spices, silk, jewels, and gold. This trading had been brought about by the expansion of the kingdom under Solomon. The expansion made it possible for the king to claim taxes on the goods that passed through his territory and on tribute from subject states. The most important trade route was the Way of the Sea, which followed the coast from Egypt through what had been Philistine country. It then turned northeast to Megiddo and Hazor and went through to Damascus. The hill route from Egypt passed through Beersheba, Hebron, Jerusalem, Bethel, and Shechem, and then divided either toward Beth Shan and out to Damascus, or to Samaria and on to Megiddo. But it was a difficult route used only in wet weather when other routes were made impossible. East of the Dead Sea and the River Jordan, the King's Highway connected the Gulf of Aqaba with Ammon and Damascus. Sea routes were controlled by the Phoenicians, who were in alliance with Solomon. As the major trade routes went through areas controlled by the Jews, it was possible for those with any capital both to import and export goods. Solomon seems to have imported horses from Cilicia and chariots from Egypt, and to have exported them both. Arrangements were also made so that kings could have an open market for their goods in neighboring cities. And Ahab had such an arrangement in Damascus. The problem with such trading is that those with capital tend to acquire more and more wealth, while those without capital get relatively poorer. This seems to have happened individually and nationally. Individuals were condemned by Amos, particularly where this kind of wealth was joined with oppression of the poorer people. Tyre was condemned for giving a bad return to the poorer nations that needed her goods. By New Testament times, trading was a way of life. In the Pax Romana, the Roman peace, increased the possibility for trade because travel was much safer. Rome became the center of wealth and commerce, as the saying, all roads lead to Rome. In this period, increased quantities of olive oil were exported from Judea, while Greek wines, glass, apples, cheeses, linen, and cotton became common in the country. Okay, lastly, the marketplace. We know little of the way that trading was done locally. There was normally an open place inside the city gate that served as a market square, and streets leading from the square would have served as dwellings for traders. There was a street of the bakers in Jeremiah's time. In the valley between the eastern and western ridges of Jerusalem was known as the Valley of the Cheesemakers. It is clear that there must have been stalls to serve people who lived in the city, because fresh food had to be purchased each day. A weekly market was available for people from the surrounding villages to buy and to sell produce. Nehemiah had to regulate things so that there were no markets on the Sabbath. Goods were displayed at ground level, with the seller sitting among them. Special markets would be set up when a caravan arrived. Prices were seldom fixed, so every purchase needed some form of bargaining. Proverbs 20:14 sees the person who, while in the market, grumbled at the high price he had to pay, but when he got home boasted of the bargain. Goods in kind were accepted as exchange, as well as weighted amounts of metal or coinage. Measurement was always full. When Jesus was describing how a measure should be pressed down with grain, shaken together and topped up until it overflowed, he was describing the standard practice for giving goods a dry measure in the market. All right. We made it.
Yeah.
Okay. So with this chapter, like I commented or mentioned at the beginning of the class, I didn't have a test made up for it from the last time I taught this class, so I've got to go and do that. And therefore, also at the same time, I'll be formulating a study guide, and I'll try and get that printed off for y'all by the end of the day before y'all leave. All right, test next week on chapters 8 and 9. I think that's about it. Any questions or comments before we end out the class? All right, well, if not, we'll close with a word of prayer. Would any of y'all like to lead us in that? Let's pray. Dear Heavenly Father, I come to you now, Lord. I thank you for the day that you've given us. Lord, I thank you for the students. Lord, I thank you for all the instructors. Lord, just be with us as we continue out this semester. Lord, as we near closer to finals. Lord, just help us to really to get into our studies. Lord, to recall what we've studied from the beginning of the year. And Lord, just prepare our minds for finals. And Lord, I just thank you for the day that we've had so far. Lord, I ask you to be with us as we finish out our week at school. Lord, and also lift up all those that have been mentioned for prayer at the beginning of class. You know, each and every one of them. Lord, all of their needs, and also all the unspoken requests upon our hearts. Lord, also lift up our online students. Lord, be with them in their daily walks and their ministries. And Lord, just be with all of us. Lord, help us to do better. Convict us about our work for you, and especially the work in regards to reaching the lost with the gospel. Lord, just help us to take that even more seriously as the day draws closer of your Son's return. And Lord, once again, we ask all these things in the name of Jesus. Amen.